This video is created for storytelling while the real names, locations, and identifying information have been changed to protect the privacy and dignity of the individuals and families involved. Viewer discretion is advised.
Welcome back to the channel. If you're here late at night looking for a story to drift off to, you're in the right place. Before we begin, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. The house on Briar Hollow Lane was the kind people slowed down to admire. 2 stories, white columns, perfect lawn lines, the kind of place that whispered stability, success, control. On warm evenings, neighbors would see Daniel Mercer standing in the driveway with a coffee mug, watching his daughters ride their bikes in careful circles. He always smiled, always waved, always looked like a man who had figured life out. He had built everything from nothing. Daniel grew up in a cramped apartment over a hardware store in Dayton. His father worked long hours. His mother clipped coupons like it was a competitive sport. Money was tight, and Daniel learned early that security wasn't something you waited for. You manufactured it. He studied finance in college, graduated near the top of his class, and by 35 he was running a private wealth advisory firm. Not flashy, not loud, just disciplined, conservative portfolios, careful growth. He became known for calm thinking during volatile markets. Clients trusted him, and he liked that. Trust meant control. Control meant safety. He married Claire when he was 29. She had an easy laugh and a way of softening his sharper edges. Where he was rigid, she was warm. Where he worried, she reassured. Together, they looked balanced. 2 daughters followed, Lily first, then Emma. From the outside, it was a textbook life, but the cracks began quietly. It started with the market downturn. Daniel had always prepared for volatility. That was his brand. But this wasn't routine turbulence. Several large clients pulled out at once, reacting emotionally. He warned them not to. They didn't listen. Withdrawals stacked up. Revenue dipped. He didn't tell Claire how serious it was. He told himself it was temporary. Then came the lawsuit. One client accused the firm of mismanagement after refusing to follow Daniel's advice during a downturn. The case lacked substance, but the legal fees were relentless. Depositions, document requests, endless meetings with attorneys. Daniel stopped sleeping well. He began waking at 3:17 a.m. every night. Same time, same dread. Claire would roll over and ask if he was okay. "Just thinking," he'd whisper. He started working later, then earlier, then constantly. The office lights glowed long after everyone else left. At first, his employees assumed he was being diligent, dedicated. Then they noticed the change. He double-checked their work obsessively, questioned minor decisions, rewrote emails before allowing them to send. One assistant told her husband, "It's like he doesn't trust anyone anymore." Daniel wasn't paranoid, not yet, but he felt something shifting. He began to believe people were watching his business more closely than usual, competitors maybe, or former clients. He started scrutinizing online reviews, reading between the lines, convinced that certain phrases were coded attacks. Claire noticed the tension at home. He snapped more easily. Small things, a misplaced bill, a late payment reminder, the girls leaving lights on upstairs. He would stand in the hallway and stare up at the ceiling, jaw tight, listening to the hum of electricity like it was draining something vital from him. Claire suggested he speak to someone. "Just to unload," she said gently. "You've been carrying so much." Daniel resisted. He wasn't unstable. He was under pressure. There's a difference. Eventually, after a particularly sharp argument over finances, he agreed to see a physician. The diagnosis was clinical depression with anxiety features. The doctor prescribed medication and recommended therapy. Daniel took the prescription home and stared at the bottle for a long time. He did not like the idea of relying on something chemical to stabilize him, but he also didn't like how he felt. The medication seemed to help at first. His edges softened. He laughed once at dinner. Claire noticed immediately. "See," she said, "you're still in there." But something else crept in with the calm, a restlessness. His thoughts moved faster. He began sketching aggressive business comeback strategies in notebooks at midnight. New investment models, bold expansions, high-risk acquisitions that contradicted his entire professional philosophy. He told himself he was evolving, adapt or die. He began speaking about resetting everything with an intensity that made Claire uneasy. "Sometimes," he said one evening, staring at the backyard through the kitchen window, "you have to burn down what isn't working so you can rebuild it properly." Claire thought he meant the firm. She did not realize how literal that metaphor felt to him. The lawsuit dragged on. Legal bills mounted. Daniel refinanced the house quietly. Claire found out by accident when a letter arrived from the bank. That night was the first time she truly looked afraid. "You didn't tell me," she said, voice trembling. "I'm handling it," he replied sharply. "Handling it how?" "I have a plan." But the plan was fragmenting. Sleep became rarer. Daniel started pacing the house at night, checking doors, checking windows, adjusting security cameras, even though there had been no threat. He installed additional locks. He told Claire it was precautionary. She began sleeping lightly. The girls sensed the tension without understanding it. Lily asked once at breakfast, "Is Daddy mad at us?" Claire forced a smile. Of course not. But Daniel's face had changed. There was a hollowness behind his eyes, as if he were watching something only he could see. He began to believe the lawsuit was more coordinated than it was, that competitors were collaborating, that financial media analysts were indirectly referencing his firm. He searched his own name online repeatedly. He read meaning into randomness. When Claire suggested adjusting the medication dosage after noticing his agitation, he reacted defensively. "You think I'm crazy?" "No," she said carefully. "I think you're overwhelmed." He didn't like that word. Overwhelmed implied weakness, and Daniel Mercer did not do weakness. One afternoon, an employee found him sitting alone in the conference room with the blinds drawn, staring at printed financial statements spread across the table like a crime scene evidence. "You okay?" the employee asked gently. "Fine, just analyzing variables." Variables, that's what everything became to him. His daughter's laughter downstairs was a variable. Claire's questions were variables. The firm's shrinking revenue was a catastrophic variable. He began speaking in abstract terms about containment and protection. Claire tried again to get him into therapy consistently. He attended 2 sessions, then stopped, claiming the therapist didn't understand high-performance minds. At night, when the house fell silent, Daniel would stand at the foot of the staircase and look up into the darkness. The home he built, the life he constructed, everything felt fragile now, like glass under pressure. In his mind, a narrative began forming, a story where external forces were closing in, where humiliation was inevitable, where failure would stain his daughter's future permanently. He told himself he was thinking strategically, but the thoughts were no longer rational calculations. They were spiraling interpretations. One evening, Claire confronted him directly. "You're scaring me." The words hung between them. For a moment, Daniel still softened. He looked almost hurt. "I'm doing this for us," he said quietly. "Doing what?" "Protecting what matters." Claire felt a chill she couldn't explain. Outside, the neighborhood was peaceful. Porch lights glowed. Sprinklers clicked rhythmically across manicured lawns. Inside, something was unraveling. Daniel stood alone in his office later that night, staring at the framed family portrait on his desk. Claire smiling, Lily missing a front tooth, Emma mid-giggle. He traced the edge of the frame with his thumb. In his mind, protection and destruction were beginning to blur, and he was starting to believe that control could only be regained through something drastic. He closed the office door, locked it, and began writing. The shift was subtle at first. Not louder, not violent, just narrower. Daniel's world began shrinking to a single obsessive axis: containment. He stopped talking about recovery and started talking about inevitability. The lawsuit would not just damage the firm, he insisted. It would expose them, humiliate them, ruin the girl's future before it began. Claire tried logic. It's a civil dispute. It's not a scandal. But Daniel had moved beyond probability. In his mind, it was already unfolding. Headlines, neighbors whispering, clients vanishing. He wasn't reacting to reality anymore. He was reacting to a story only he could see. The medication dosage had been increased 2 weeks earlier. His physician believed the agitation signaled untreated anxiety. Daniel described racing thoughts, bursts of energy, minimal sleep. He framed it as productivity. "I'm sharper than ever," he said during the appointment. Claire sat quietly beside him, fingers intertwined, watching his knee bounce uncontrollably. At home, his energy felt different, not focused, accelerated. He reorganized the garage at 2 a.m., drafted elaborate contingency plans, sketched flowcharts mapping threat actors who might be working against him. Competitors' names appeared in the margins, former clients, even an old college acquaintance who once criticized active portfolio management on social media. Claire found the notebook by accident. She didn't recognize the handwriting at first. It was his, but jagged, pressed hard into the paper. She confronted him gently. "Who are these people?" He smiled without warmth. "Variables." That word again. He began installing additional security software on his laptop, changed passwords repeatedly, set up new cameras inside the house, claiming external ones had blind spots. The cameras noticed first. "Why are those there?" Lily asked. "Just making sure everyone's safe," Daniel replied. "Safe from what?" No one asked directly. Claire's sleep deteriorated. She would wake to the soft glow under Daniel's office door and hear pacing, sometimes whispering. Once she pressed her ear against the wood and heard him rehearsing conversations, imaginary ones. He spoke calmly, articulately, as if defending himself to an invisible jury. "I acted responsibly," he said to no one. "You forced my hand." That phrase unsettled her more than anything else. "You forced my hand." 3 weeks before the night, a small but pivotal event occurred. A regional business blog published a piece analyzing local firms affected by the downturn. Daniel's company was mentioned in passing, not criticized, simply listed among several facing revenue contraction. To Claire, it was benign. To Daniel, it was confirmation. "They're setting the narrative," he said, eyes fixed on the screen. "Daniel," Claire said carefully, "it's data. It's not an attack." But he was already connecting dots that did not exist. He began withdrawing cash in small increments, nothing dramatic, a few thousand at a time. When Claire noticed irregularities in their account, he explained it as liquidity management. He started speaking about relocation. "Maybe we start over somewhere smaller before things get ugly." "Things aren't ugly. They're difficult." He shook his head slowly as if she were naive. "You're not seeing the full picture." In truth, there was no full picture, only distortion. His sleep by then was nearly non-existent, 2 hours a night, sometimes none. He refused to adjust the medication again, insisting the intensity was necessary. "I can't afford to dull my thinking," he told Claire. But his thinking was no longer linear. It was circular, self-reinforcing. He began expressing a new fear that authorities could misinterpret financial fluctuations as misconduct, that audits might spiral into criminal investigations. There was no evidence of this, no inquiry, no accusation, but in Daniel's mind, inevitability hardened into certainty. He started researching legal statutes late at night, white-collar sentencing guidelines, asset forfeiture procedures. Claire found browser tabs open detailing federal prison conditions. "Why are you reading this?" she asked, voice unsteady. "Preparation. For what?" "For when they decide to make an example out of me." The girls sensed the strain more acutely now. Emma stopped asking him to read bedtime stories because he would stare at the pages without turning them. Lily began sleeping in Claire's bed some nights. Daniel noticed the distance, but interpreted it differently. "They're already absorbing the tension," he said one evening. "You think middle school won't amplify that? Kids are cruel." "That hasn't happened." "It will." Future humiliation became his obsession, not current reality. He framed everything as preemptive defense. One night, about 10 days before it happened, the power flickered during a storm. Just once, a routine outage lasting seconds. Daniel froze. He walked through the house, checking breakers, windows, locks. "They're testing response time," he murmured. Claire felt a cold weight settle in her stomach. "Who is they?" He didn't answer. The following week, he met with his attorney regarding the lawsuit. The attorney was calm, confident. The case was weak and likely to settle. Daniel left the meeting unconvinced. "They're minimizing risk to keep me calm." "Or," she replied carefully, "they're professionals doing their job." He stared at her for a long time. "Why don't you trust my instincts?" "Because your instincts have changed," she wanted to say, but she didn't. Instead, she suggested a temporary separation from work, a leave of absence, time to stabilize. Daniel interpreted it as surrender. "You want me to step away while they dismantle everything?" "I want you to breathe." He laughed softly, not amused, just hollow. Breathing felt irrelevant. 3 days before the night, he gathered the family in the living room unexpectedly. He spoke with a composed intensity that felt rehearsed. "No matter what happens," he began, "I need you to know I've always acted to protect you." Claire felt her pulse spike. "Daniel," she said quietly, "nothing is happening." He nodded slowly, as if humoring her. Sometimes protection requires difficult decisions. The girls didn't understand. They sat close together on the couch, watching their father like he was delivering a lecture instead of reassurance. Later that evening, Claire called his physician's office. She described the paranoia, the insomnia, the acceleration. The nurse advised monitoring and possibly adjusting medication. The appointment was scheduled for the following week. There would not be a following week. The day before the night was deceptively calm. Daniel took the girl for ice cream. He laughed genuinely for the first time in months. He told Lily he was proud of her science project. He told Emma her drawing belonged in a gallery. Claire allowed herself a small hope. Maybe the storm had passed. But storms sometimes quiet before they break. That evening, Daniel stayed up again in his office. He reviewed financial statements one last time. Then he opened a blank document. He began typing what read less like a confession and more like a manifesto, a justification, a narrative of inevitability and forced choices. He described external pressures, legal threats, public disgrace. He described protection. He described love. In his writing, love and destruction were indistinguishable. Around 3:17 a.m., the same hour that had haunted him for months, he stood in the hallway outside his daughter's bedrooms. The house was silent. The containment plan in his mind felt complete. In that distorted logic, he believed he was preventing suffering, preventing humiliation, preventing a future he had constructed and feared. The tragedy did not erupt from rage. It emerged from a fractured belief that annihilation was mercy. By dawn, Briar Hollow Lane would no longer be admired for its symmetry and lawn lines. It would be known for something else entirely. By sunrise, the Mercer house was unrecognizable. The quiet that once marked the start of a new day had been replaced with an eerie stillness. Outside, neighbors gathered, drawn by the flashing lights of police vehicles that painted the street red and blue. Inside, the full scope of the horror came into view. Claire Mercer lay lifeless in the living room, and her daughters, Emma and Lily, had been taken from the world in their sleep. The carefully ordered home, once a sanctuary, was now a scene of unthinkable tragedy. Daniel Mercer had left the house in a haze, pills clouding his mind, but the physical evidence of his actions was indisputable. Officers found him less than a mile away, slumped over in his car, disoriented and muttering fragments of his plan. "I protected them," he said. "I couldn't let them suffer." His words, disjointed and hollow, hinted at a mind fractured beyond reason, a man who believed destruction was mercy. Authorities immediately took him into custody, recognizing both the severity of his crimes and the mental instability evident in his statements and behavior. The investigation that followed uncovered a chilling mix of meticulous planning and delusional justification. Police discovered the detailed notes, flowcharts, and contingency plans he had left behind. Financial records showed desperate maneuvers and growing instability, while his journal entries revealed paranoia and obsession. Medical reports confirmed the medications he had been prescribed, an antidepressant and an anxiolytic, could, in rare cases, exacerbate anxiety, paranoia, and impulsive behavior. Yet experts disagreed on whether these drugs were a catalyst or simply coincidental to his unraveling. As the trial began, the courtroom was thick with grief and tension. Claire's family and friends filled the gallery, their eyes red from sleepless nights and endless questions of why. Prosecutors presented a case portraying Daniel as a man who, despite financial pressure and mental strain, acted with cold deliberation. They detailed the sequence of the murders, emphasizing his repeated trips to reload the firearm, the deliberate targeting of each family member, and the writing of a manifesto that preemptively explained his actions. To the prosecution, this was calculated premeditation, not the result of temporary psychosis. The defense countered with a different portrait. They described a man consumed by depression, suffering from severe anxiety and paranoia, his mental state worsened by medications intended to stabilize him. Psychiatrists testified that Daniel's thought patterns had become circular and obsessive, with a distorted perception of threats and inevitability. They argued he believed he was sparing his family from humiliation, financial ruin, and public disgrace, a delusion rooted not in malice, but in a deep, tragic break from reality. Witnesses painted the tension leading up to the murders. Claire testified about the last weeks before the tragedy, the late-night pacing, the obsessive research, and the way Daniel had withdrawn entirely from family life. Neighbors recounted seeing him taking unusually long walks late at night, muttering to himself. Even colleagues noticed his erratic communications, urgent emails filled with paranoia, calls that seemed frantic and incomprehensible. His sister, Julia Mercer, shared that Daniel frequently spoke about protection, containment, and preemptive action, never revealing the dark specifics of what he envisioned. Throughout the proceedings, the jury grappled with a central question. Did Daniel Mercer knowingly and intentionally take these lives, or was he a man whose mind had collapsed under extreme pressure, rendering him incapable of distinguishing right from wrong? Both narratives held pieces of the truth. His meticulous planning suggested intent, yet the depth of his paranoia and the influence of psychotropic medication raised genuine doubts about his capacity to fully comprehend his actions. Ultimately, the jury's deliberation reflected this conflict. After days of careful consideration, weighing testimony from psychiatrists, family members, and law enforcement, they reached the verdict. Daniel Mercer was found guilty on all counts: first-degree murder for his wife and daughters. The judge, acknowledging the complex interplay of mental illness and premeditated violence, sentenced him to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. For the community of Briar Hollow Lane, the sentence brought no real solace. The Mercer home remained empty for years, a silent monument to the loss of 3 lives and the fragility of appearances. Neighbors spoke quietly of Claire and her daughters, remembering moments of joy and innocence, now forever overshadowed by tragedy. Psychologists and legal scholars later used the case to examine the effects of untreated mental illness, the risks of medication side effects, and the warning signs that often precede family tragedies. Even decades later, those involved struggled with lingering questions. Could the sequence of events have been prevented? Were there signs others could have intervened upon? What combination of fear, paranoia, and desperation had pushed a man from devotion to destruction? There were no definitive answers, only fragments of understanding pieced together from testimonies, medical reports, and personal accounts. The Mercer story is a stark reminder that appearances can be deceiving. A family may seem perfect from the outside, thriving and loved, while underneath, unseen pressures build quietly until they erupt in irreversible violence. Daniel Mercer's actions left a void not only in the lives of his family, but in the consciousness of everyone who knew them or who learned of their fate. It was a tragedy that would continue to be studied, mourned, and discussed, a cautionary tale about the fragile line between stability and collapse, love and destruction. And as the courtroom emptied and the gavel fell, one truth remained undeniable. Claire Mercer and her daughters, Emma and Lily, were gone forever, victims of a father consumed by fear, medication, and a mind that had lost its way. The only legacy left behind was grief, lessons for others, and the haunting question of what drives someone to believe that ending the lives of those they love could ever be an act of care. The case closed legally, but its shadow lingered in every quiet suburban street, every family who faced financial strain, mental health challenges, or anxiety that seemed too overwhelming to bear. It was a story of love twisted into tragedy, a reminder of the hidden dangers lurking behind closed doors, and the devastating consequences when fear overwhelms reason. This is the story of the Mercer family, a family that once embodied perfection, now defined by heartbreak, loss, and the dark complexities of a troubled mind. In the quiet English town of Ravenbrook, a place known for its peaceful streets and close-knit neighborhoods, few people ever locked their doors during the day. Everyone knew everyone, and strangers rarely stayed strangers for long. At the center of this small community stood a modest medical clinic on Oakwell Street. The clinic had served Ravenbrook residents for decades, but for many years it had been known for one man above all others, Dr. Adrian Whitaker. To most people in Ravenbrook, Dr. Whitaker represented everything a community doctor should be. Calm, attentive, and reassuring, he had an easy way of speaking with patients that made them feel heard and understood. Elderly residents especially trusted him. Many of them had known him for years. What almost nobody realized was that behind the polite smile and professional demeanor was a man carrying a complicated past. Adrian Whitaker had been born in 1947 in the industrial city of Northbridge, about 200 miles from Ravenbrook. His childhood had been shaped largely by one powerful figure in his life, his mother, Margaret Whitaker. Margaret was known among neighbors as a fiercely controlling woman. She dictated nearly every detail of her son's life, from what he wore to how he spent his evenings. While Adrian performed well in school and showed strong academic ability, his social life never really developed. Other children found him distant and difficult to connect with. Teachers noticed the same pattern. Adrian was intelligent, focused, and capable of impressive academic work, but he rarely formed friendships. Outside of school, his world revolved almost entirely around his mother. Margaret, however, constantly reinforced the idea that her son was destined for greatness. She told him he was smarter than the other children, that one day he would accomplish something extraordinary. Adrian absorbed these words deeply. Then everything changed. When Adrian was 16 years old, his mother was diagnosed with an aggressive form of cancer. The illness progressed rapidly, and Margaret spent the final months of her life mostly confined to their home. During that time, Adrian became her constant companion. Every afternoon after school, he would sit beside her bed while the family doctor visited to administer powerful pain medication. Adrian watched closely as the doctor injected the drug into Margaret's arm. Within minutes, her breathing would slow, the pain would fade, her expression would soften into something that looked almost peaceful. For Adrian, the transformation was mesmerizing. Moments earlier, his mother would be gasping in agony. Then, after a single injection, the suffering disappeared. The power of medicine to control pain, to calm the body, even to determine the moment someone slipped into unconsciousness, fascinated him. Margaret Whittaker passed away in June of 1963. Her death left Adrian devastated. For months, he withdrew even further from the world around him. But one idea had taken root in his mind. He would become a doctor. At 19, Adrian enrolled in Westmore Medical University, where he quickly distinguished himself as an outstanding student. His professors praised his discipline and dedication. Medicine seemed to come naturally to him. It was during his time at university that he met Emily Carter, a quiet nursing student with a gentle personality. Emily was one of the few people who seemed capable of reaching Adrian emotionally. The two began dating, and within a few years, they were married. Friends described their relationship as stable and uncomplicated. Emily was supportive and patient, while Adrian focused intensely on his career. After graduating from medical school, Dr. Whittaker accepted a position as a general practitioner in Ravenbrook. The town welcomed him warmly. He treated patients in their homes, made late-night calls when emergencies arose, and took extra time with elderly residents who needed reassurance more than anything else. Within a few years, Dr. Whittaker had become one of the most trusted professionals in town. But early in his career, a troubling incident briefly threatened to derail everything. In 1976, hospital administrators discovered irregularities in several prescription records connected to Dr. Whittaker. Certain controlled pain medications had been issued under patient names that didn't fully match clinic records. An internal investigation revealed that Whittaker had been prescribing small quantities of the drugs for personal use. The discovery shocked colleagues who knew him as a disciplined professional. Whittaker insisted he had been struggling with severe stress and exhaustion from long hours. He agreed to undergo a rehabilitation program and temporarily stepped away from medical practice. After completing treatment, he returned to work 2 years later. Many people believed the incident had been a youthful mistake, something he had learned from and moved beyond. And for a long time, nothing seemed out of place. Dr. Whittaker rebuilt his reputation. His clinic expanded, his patient list grew. Families trusted him with their parents and grandparents. Over time, he became a permanent fixture of life in Ravenbrook. But quietly, almost imperceptibly, a disturbing pattern was beginning to emerge. Throughout the 1980s and 1990s, an unusually large number of Whittaker's elderly patients passed away. In most cases, their deaths seemed natural. They were older individuals, many living alone. When a patient died at home, Dr. Whittaker would often be the one who had seen them last. He signed death certificates without hesitation, usually attributing the cause to heart failure or other age-related conditions. Because Ravenbrook trusted him so completely, few people questioned these conclusions. But someone eventually began to notice something unusual. Thomas Granger, the town's undertaker, had handled funerals in Ravenbrook for nearly 30 years. His job required him to transport the deceased from homes, hospitals, and care facilities. Over time, he started recognizing certain patterns. An unusually high number of the people he collected had been patients of Dr. Whitaker. Even more puzzling was the condition in which many of them were found. Several had appeared healthy just days earlier. Some had been active members of the community with no serious illnesses, yet they had suddenly passed away at home. At first, Granger assumed it was coincidence, but as the years passed, the pattern became harder to ignore. One evening, while preparing paperwork for another funeral, he looked back through his records and counted. The number was startling. Dozens of recent deaths had occurred among patients who had been under Whitaker shortly before passing. Granger mentioned his concerns casually to a local nurse he knew. The nurse shrugged it off. Dr. Whitaker's patients are mostly elderly. People that age pass away. It's normal. Still, the unease remained. Then, in the summer of 1998, a single death would change everything. The victim was Margaret Holloway, an 81-year-old widow who lived alone in a small cottage near the center of town. Margaret was well known in Ravenbrook. She attended church regularly and remained active in community events. Friends described her as sharp-minded and independent. So when she was suddenly found dead in her living room one afternoon, the news spread quickly. Dr. Whitaker told neighbors he had visited her earlier that day to conduct routine medical tests. He explained that Margaret likely suffered a sudden heart attack shortly after he left. At first, everyone accepted his explanation, until Margaret's daughter began asking questions that would soon lead investigators down a path no one in Ravenbrook had ever imagined. And at the center of that path stood the town's most trusted doctor. Margaret Holloway's death might have passed quietly like many others in Ravenbrook, if not for her daughter. Laura Bennett lived nearly 3 hours away in the city of York. She visited her mother when she could, but Margaret valued her independence and insisted on living alone in the small cottage she had shared with her late husband. When Laura received the call that her mother had died suddenly, she was shocked but not entirely surprised. Margaret was 81 after all. Still, something about the situation felt strange. According to Dr. Adrian Whitaker, Margaret had seemed perfectly fine during his visit earlier that morning. He had simply stopped by to perform routine blood tests. When Laura asked if an autopsy would be necessary, Whitaker calmly reassured her that there was no reason for one. It was almost certainly a heart attack, he told her gently. At her age, these things can happen without warning. Laura wanted to believe him. After all, the entire town trusted Dr. Whitaker. But a few days later, something unexpected happened. Laura received a phone call from her mother's solicitor. The solicitor sounded confused. He explained that Margaret Holloway had recently submitted a new will. In that document, Margaret had left the majority of her savings, nearly £300,000, to someone outside the family. That person was Dr. Adrian Whitaker. Laura felt the runes spin. Her mother had always been careful with money, and she had made it clear many times that whatever remained would eventually go to Laura and her children. The idea that Margaret had suddenly given everything to a doctor she only saw a few times a year made no sense. Laura immediately asked to see the will. When the document arrived, her suspicions grew stronger. The writing looked strange, the formatting was clumsy, and several spelling errors appeared in places her mother would never have made mistakes. Even more concerning was the signature. It didn't look quite right. Margaret had always signed her name in a careful, flowing script, but the signature on this document appeared stiff and uneven. Laura decided she needed answers. She contacted the local police in Ravenbrook and explained her concerns. At first, the officers believed they were dealing with a simple case of forgery. Someone had probably created a fake will in hopes of claiming the inheritance. Still, the name involved made the situation unusual. Dr. Adrian Whitaker was one of the most respected figures in the town. The idea that he could be involved in something criminal seemed almost absurd. Nevertheless, investigators agreed to look into it. Detective Martin Hargreaves, a seasoned investigator from the regional police department, was assigned to the case. Hargreaves began with the basics. He visited the Holloway cottage and spoke with neighbors who had seen Margaret in the days before her death. Every single one of them described her as perfectly healthy. She was gardening the day before, one neighbor said, looked stronger than half the people my age. The detective also confirmed that Dr. Whitaker had indeed been the last person to see her alive. Next, Hargreaves visited Whitaker's clinic. The doctor greeted him politely and answered questions without hesitation. He explained that Margaret had complained of mild fatigue during the visit, but nothing serious. When asked about the will, Whitaker appeared surprised. Margaret mentioned wanting to update some paperwork, he said calmly, but I had no idea she included me in it. The explanation sounded reasonable on the surface, but something about Whitaker's behavior bothered Hargreaves. The doctor seemed almost too composed. Most people would react with shock or concern when accused of being connected to a suspicious will. Whitaker, however, remained perfectly calm. Hargreaves requested access to Margaret Holloway's medical records. Whitaker agreed. At first glance, the records supported his story. Margaret had a history of minor heart issues and had recently complained of occasional dizziness. But when the detective shared the information with a medical consultant, the consultant noticed something strange. Several entries in the records appeared to have been added recently. The timestamps suggested that portions of Margaret's medical history had been edited after her death. That discovery changed everything. Detectives obtained warrants to search Whitaker's clinic and home office. What they found raised even more questions. Inside the office, they discovered a typewriter that closely matched the one used to create the suspicious will. Several pieces of old jewelry belonging to former patients were also found in a desk drawer. Whitaker claimed the items had been given to him as gifts over the years, but investigators weren't convinced. Even more troubling was what they discovered on Whitaker's computer system. Although the doctor had tried to update patient records to justify certain treatments, the computer software kept a hidden log of every change. Each edit had a timestamp. When analysts examined the data, they saw that Whitaker had modified multiple patient records shortly after those patients had died. The changes often included notes claiming the patient had been suffering from severe pain or terminal illness, conditions that would justify the use of powerful medications. But when detectives spoke to family members, many of them insisted their relatives had been perfectly healthy before their sudden deaths. One pattern appeared repeatedly. Whitaker had often visited elderly patients at home shortly before they passed away. In many cases, he had advised families that an autopsy wasn't necessary. He also frequently encouraged them to cremate the bodies quickly. The deeper investigators looked, the more disturbing the pattern became. Records showed that an unusually high number of Whitaker's former patients had died over the past 20 years, much higher than the average for other doctors in the same region. Detective Hargreaves began reviewing decades of death certificates signed by Whitaker. The list was long, very long. In fact, when analysts compared Whitaker's records to those of other physicians, they found something alarming. Over the course of his career in Ravenbrook, hundreds of patients had died under his care. Of course, many of those deaths were likely natural. Elderly patients often passed away peacefully at home, but the numbers still stood out. They were far above normal. The investigation was now expanding far beyond the original forgery case. Margaret Holloway's body was exhumed so that a full forensic examination could be performed. When toxicology results came back, the findings shocked everyone involved. Margaret had died with an extremely high concentration of powerful pain medication in her bloodstream. The dosage was far beyond anything that would normally be prescribed. The evidence suggested she had been injected shortly before her death. Police returned to Dr. Whitaker with the new information, but the doctor refused to answer questions. During the interview, he simply sat in silence, staring at the table in front of him. When investigators mentioned the names of certain deceased patients, he showed almost no reaction, except once. When they spoke the name Margaret Holloway, Whitaker paused for several seconds before responding. It was the first sign that the calm and composed doctor might be hiding something much darker. By early 1999, the investigation had grown into one of the largest criminal inquiries in the region's history. Detectives were now examining the deaths of dozens of Whitaker's former patients, and with every new file they opened, the possibility became harder to ignore. Ravenbrook's trusted doctor might not just be guilty of forgery, he might be responsible for something far more horrifying, something that had been hidden in plain sight for more than 20 years. By the beginning of 1999, the investigation into Dr. Adrian Whitaker had grown into something far larger than anyone in Ravenbrook had imagined. What had started as a suspicious will was now turning into a massive criminal inquiry that reached back more than 20 years. Detective Martin Hargreaves and his team were working around the clock. Patient files filled entire rooms at the regional police headquarters. Investigators combed through decades of medical records, death certificates, and prescription logs connected to Whitaker's practice. At first, the numbers alone were shocking. Since opening his clinic in Ravenbrook in the late 1970s, hundreds of patients had died under Whitaker's care. Of course, many of those deaths could easily be explained. Most of his patients were elderly and natural deaths were common, but the pattern was impossible to ignore. Compared to other doctors in the region, Whitaker's patients died far more frequently and often under similar circumstances. Many were found at home, sitting peacefully in chairs or lying on sofas, as if they had simply drifted away in their sleep. But forensic specialists now knew something the public did not. The exhumation of Margaret Holloway had revealed extremely high levels of a powerful pain medication in her bloodstream. The concentration was far beyond anything that would normally be prescribed for a patient in her condition. This discovery prompted authorities to exhume several additional bodies belonging to Whitaker's former patients. The results were deeply disturbing. Again and again, toxicology reports revealed the same pattern: unusually high concentrations of sedative drugs and painkillers administered shortly before death. Many of these patients had not been suffering from serious illnesses. Some had been healthy enough to shop, garden, and attend social events just days earlier. For the first time, investigators began to consider a horrifying possibility. Dr. Adrian Whitaker might not just be responsible for one or two suspicious deaths. He might be responsible for dozens. As the investigation expanded, detectives interviewed family members of the deceased. Many shared similar stories. Whitaker had often been the last person to see their loved one alive. He had visited their homes, conducted brief examinations, and then left. Hours later, the patient would be found dead. In many cases, Whitaker had assured families that the death was natural and that an autopsy wasn't necessary. Several families also remembered something else. Whitaker had encouraged them to cremate the bodies quickly, explaining that it would spare them additional emotional stress. At the time, these suggestions had seemed compassionate. Now they felt chilling. By the summer of 1999, police believed they had enough evidence to move forward. Dr. Adrian Whitaker was formally charged with multiple counts of murder and forgery. The news sent shockwaves through Ravenbrook. Residents struggled to reconcile the allegations with the man they believed they knew. For decades, Whitaker had been their trusted doctor, someone who had delivered their children and cared for their parents. Many refused to believe the accusations. Others began remembering small details that now seemed troubling. The trial began in October 1999 and quickly became one of the most closely followed criminal cases in the country. The courtroom was filled with journalists, legal experts, and family members of the victims. Prosecutors presented a detailed picture of Whitaker's methods. They explained how he would visit elderly patients during routine appointments, often when they were alone. During these visits, he administered injections of powerful drugs in quantities large enough to cause death. Afterward, he would falsify the patient's medical records to suggest they had been suffering from severe conditions that justified such treatment. Computer records played a critical role in the case. Although Whitaker believed he had covered his tracks by editing medical files, the clinic's software system had automatically recorded every change. Investigators were able to see exactly when certain entries had been altered. In many cases, Whitaker updated patient histories after the patient had already died, adding symptoms that had never been documented before. The forged will connected to Margaret Holloway also became a central piece of evidence. Forensic analysts confirmed that the document had been typed using Whitaker's own typewriter. Handwriting experts testified that the signature on the will had been forged. Perhaps the most powerful testimony came from the families of Whitaker's victims. One after another, they described the trust they had placed in him. They spoke about the shock of learning that the man they had relied on for medical care might have been responsible for their loved ones' deaths. Throughout the entire trial, Dr. Adrian Whitaker remained eerily calm. He rarely spoke, often sitting motionless as witnesses described the events surrounding the deaths. When asked directly about the accusations, he simply denied them. His defense team argued that the deaths were being misinterpreted. They claimed the medications found in the victims' bodies could have been the result of legitimate medical treatment. But the evidence continued to mount. By the end of the trial, prosecutors had demonstrated a clear pattern that spanned decades. Whitaker had repeatedly targeted elderly patients living alone. He had administered lethal doses of medication and then altered their records to make the deaths appear natural. In January 2000, the jury delivered the verdict. Dr. Adrian Whitaker was found guilty of 15 counts of murder and 1 count of forgery. The judge sentenced him to multiple life sentences, ensuring that he would spend the remainder of his life in prison. But even after the conviction, the full scale of Whitaker's crimes remained uncertain. A government inquiry launched shortly after the trial examined thousands of medical records connected to his practice. The findings were staggering. Investigators concluded that the number of Whitaker's victims could be well over 200. If accurate, that would make him one of the most prolific serial killers in modern history. Yet despite the overwhelming evidence, Dr. Whitaker never admitted responsibility. He maintained his innocence during every appeal and refused to discuss the crimes with psychologists or investigators. Experts debated the motives behind his actions. Some believed Whitaker had developed a God complex, enjoying the power to decide who lived and who died. Others suggested his childhood experiences with his dying mother may have shaped his perception of illness and control over suffering. But the truth remained locked inside Dr. Whitaker's mind. In January 2004, 4 years after his conviction, prison guards discovered Dr. Adrian Whitaker dead in his cell. he had taken his own life. For the families of his victims, the news brought mixed emotions. Some felt relief that the man responsible for so much loss was gone. Others were frustrated that he had died without ever explaining his actions or revealing the full truth behind the decades of death that followed him. In Ravenbrook, the small clinic on Oakwell Street eventually closed its doors. The building still stands today, quiet and empty. For many residents, it serves as a reminder of how easily trust can be misplaced and how sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is the one everyone believes is there to help.